The courtroom smelled of old wood, ink, and the faint trace of cigar smoke lingering in the air. The space was filled with an unsettling silence, the kind that only existed in places where judgment was passed, where destinies were decided with the strike of a gavel. The gallery was full, lawyers shuffling papers, clerks moving with practiced efficiency, and officers standing near the exits, their expressions unreadable. Among them was a man who didn't just wear his badge, he carried it like a weapon, like an unquestionable mark of authority. A uniform, crisp and untouchable, wrapped around his arrogance like a second skin. He walked through the courtroom with an air of ownership, his boots clicking against the polished floor as if he belonged to a higher order, above rules, above scrutiny, above consequence. Then, his eyes locked onto her. She stood in quiet composure, poised with a dignity that he found intolerable. A black woman in a place of power. That sight alone made something bitter rise in his throat. He had dealt with people like her before, too confident, too certain of their place in a world he believed was never meant for them. He had put plenty of them in their place. He thought this would be no different. A slow, deliberate smirk spread across his lips as he pulled out a cigar from his pocket, running his fingers over the fine tobacco before placing it between his teeth. He lit it, inhaling deeply, letting the scent spread around him like a display of dominance. He could feel eyes on him, but he didn't care. This was his domain. He had operated in the system long enough to know that men like him didn't face consequences. They enforced them. He took a step closer, exhaling a thick cloud of smoke in her direction. She didn't react. She just stood there, still as a statue, watching him. That lack of fear irritated him. He wanted to see her flinch. He wanted to see the power drain from her eyes, to remind her that in the real world, where force mattered more than words, she was nothing. "You should know your place," he said, voice dripping with contempt, the cigar dangling from his fingers. Still, nothing. No reaction. No fear. That made him furious. Before anyone could move, before anyone could even register what was happening, he grabbed her by the collar with one hand and, with the other, pressed the burning tip of his cigar against her cheek. A sharp sizzle filled the air, a sound that would stay burned into the minds of every person in that room. A hiss of scorched skin, the acrid scent of burning flesh mixing with the tobacco. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few people rose from their seats, but no one intervened. Not yet. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She didn't even step back. She just looked at him. A stare so steady, so unwavering, that for the first time in his life, he was the one who felt unsettled. Her cheek was red, the burn beginning to take shape, but she was still there, still standing, still holding that unbearable silence. A silence heavier than any words she could have spoken. It was the kind of silence that meant something more. The kind of silence that only happened right before everything changed. The courtroom, once filled with unshaken confidence in his authority, now felt different. The weight of what he had done settled into the air, an unspoken tension pressing against every person in the room. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, just a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it down. He had done worse before. Then, something shifted. A murmur in the gallery. A change in posture among the legal teams. The officers near the door exchanging uncertain glances. Someone whispered something, and suddenly, the room was no longer on his side. Then came the first audible voice from the crowd, sharp, clear, and cutting through the silence like a blade. "Oh my God, does he even know?" A second voice followed, disbelief and barely contained excitement in its tone. "He has no idea," a third, a hushed gasp of realization. "She's the judge." The words hit him like a freight train. No. No, that couldn't be right. She couldn't be. He turned to look at the bench, where he had expected a different figure. But the chair was empty. No one was sitting there because the woman in front of him, the one he had just burned, the one he had just assaulted in front of an entire courtroom full of people, was the one who had the power to decide his fate. And just like that, everything changed. The weight of his mistake crashed into him all at once, but it was too late. His arrogance, his unchecked cruelty, had led him to do something irreversible. The audience, the attorneys, the clerks, they were no longer afraid of him. They weren't avoiding his gaze, they were staring at him, waiting, watching, eager to see what would happen next. And at the center of it all, standing tall despite the pain in her cheek, was the one woman who had every reason to destroy him. And she would. The only question now was how. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and any form of injustice. This channel is a space where powerful stories unfold, stories that expose truth, demand justice, and celebrate resilience. If you're a Black viewer watching this, know that your voice, your story, and your presence matter. You deserve respect, dignity, and equality, and we will always stand with you. Now, get ready for a gripping story full of twists and justice. If you enjoy thought-provoking narratives, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let's dive in. Enjoy the story. The courtroom had always been a place of decisions, of weighty consequences, of lives altered by the swift drop of a gavel. But on that day, it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that was almost tangible, a pressure that seemed to settle on the shoulders of everyone in the room. The rows of wooden benches, polished to a dull shine by years of use, were filled with the usual mix of attorneys, reporters, and concerned citizens, each there for their own reasons. Some sought justice, others spectacle, and a few, like the man standing near the center of the room, sought nothing more than control. Lieutenant Mark Calloway had spent the last 2 decades of his life in law enforcement, and every day of it had reinforced his belief that the world operated in a certain order. That order was simple: power belonged to those who were strong enough to take it. He had built his career on that principle, climbing the ranks not through skill or dedication, but through sheer force of will and an unwavering confidence that he was untouchable. He had learned long ago that the badge was more than just a symbol of law, it was a shield, a barrier that protected men like him from the consequences of their actions. He had seen officers fired, seen a few even charged, but none like him. None who knew how to play the game the way he did. His reputation stretched beyond the station walls. He was known for his aggression, his unrelenting approach to policing, and, most of all, his ability to get away with it. There had been complaints, plenty of them. Reports of excessive force, misconduct, racial profiling. But they had all disappeared, buried beneath a system designed to protect its own. He had allies in high places, men who owed him favors, men who shared his worldview. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to manipulate the narrative. He had survived countless accusations, slipping through each one with the same smirk he wore now, as he let a stream of cigar smoke curl from his lips. The woman standing before him was different from the ones he was used to dealing with. She didn't cower. She didn't try to explain herself. She simply stood there, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. He hated that. Hated the way she carried herself with a quiet confidence, as if she belonged there, as if she had earned her place in this courtroom. Her name was Ayanna Caldwell, and she had spent her entire life fighting for the seat she now occupied. Raised in a modest home in Atlanta, she had known from an early age that the world would never hand her anything. Her father, a former defense attorney, had instilled in her a deep respect for justice, but also an awareness of its failings. She had watched him work cases that should have been easy wins, only to see his clients railroaded by a system that was never designed for them. She had seen the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried every time he lost another battle he was never meant to win. It had ignited something in her, something that only grew stronger as she got older. Ayanna was smart, brilliant, even. She had excelled in law school, earning the respect of professors who rarely acknowledged students like her. But intelligence wasn't enough. She had learned early on that no matter how hard she worked, she would have to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. So she had been relentless, pushing herself beyond limits, refusing to let the doubts of others dictate her future. When she had been appointed as a judge, it had been more than just a personal victory, it had been a statement. But none of that mattered to Mark Calloway. To him, she was just another woman who needed to be reminded of her place. The courtroom had been in session for nearly an hour before the incident. It had been an ordinary hearing, or at least, it should have been. A case of police brutality had brought them all here, one of many that had begun to gain traction in the city. The defendant, a young black man barely out of his teens, had been beaten during a traffic stop, left with a concussion and broken ribs. The officers involved had given the same tired defense: non-compliance, resistance, reasonable force. But this time, there was footage. This time, the public was watching. Calloway had shown up as a witness, though he wasn't directly involved in the case. His presence was more symbolic than anything else, a reminder that the police weren't backing down, that they still held control over these proceedings, no matter what the evidence showed. He had swaggered into the room, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the crowd like a predator surveying his territory. He had done this before, countless times, and he knew exactly how it would play out. But then there was Ayanna. She had listened carefully, her gaze steady, her questions precise. She didn't let him dodge, didn't allow him the usual room to maneuver. She pressed him, challenging his statements, forcing him to acknowledge inconsistencies. It wasn't outright defiance, but it was enough to chip away at his composure. He could feel the shift in the room, the way people were beginning to lean in, sensing that something was different this time. And then he had snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was instinct, born from years of unchecked authority, from knowing that he could act without fear of consequence. He had let his frustration turn to action, had reached for the nearest weapon he had, a lit cigar. And he had done what he had always done. He had reminded her of what he believed was the natural order. The sound of flesh burning had silenced the courtroom. But Ayanna hadn't screamed. She had stood there, unmoving, absorbing the moment as if she had expected it, as if she had been waiting for it. And then, slowly, the realization had spread. Calloway had assumed he was untouchable. He had assumed that the woman standing in front of him was powerless. He had assumed wrong. Because as the murmurs grew, as the realization took hold, as the weight of what he had just done settled into the air, one truth became undeniable. Ayanna Caldwell wasn't just any woman. She was the judge. And in that moment, Calloway's world began to unravel. The silence in the courtroom stretched long and thick, a suffocating weight that settled over everyone like a dense fog. The burn on Ayanna's cheek was still fresh, the pain sharp, but she refused to acknowledge it. She could feel the heat pulsing beneath her skin, the raw sting of the wound, but her expression remained unreadable. Her mind, however, was anything but calm. It raced, calculating, absorbing every detail of the moment, the gasps, the widening eyes, the shifting energy in the room. The power had shifted. She could feel it. Mark Calloway stood there, his smirk gone, his hand still clenched around the cigar that had just scorched her skin. For the first time in his career, doubt flickered in his gaze. He had always been sure of himself, always confident in the fact that the system would bend to his will, that no matter what he did, he would walk away unscathed. But now, as he looked at Ayanna, something was wrong. He could see it in the eyes of the people around him. The clerks, the attorneys, the jurors, they weren't looking at him the way they usually did. There was no deference, no silent agreement that he was above reproach. No, there was something else now. A quiet anticipation. Ayanna straightened, smoothing the fabric of her blazer as if nothing had happened. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room, catching every eye that dared to meet hers. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice calm, steady, but carrying the kind of weight that demanded absolute attention. "Lieutenant Calloway," she said, the syllables crisp, deliberate, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even confrontational. It was worse. It was measured, calculated, like a predator deciding whether or not its prey was worth the effort of the hunt. Calloway blinked, the first hint of uncertainty flashing across his face. He had expected her to lash out, to scream, to demand his arrest in a fit of rage. That was what people like her did, wasn't it? They got emotional, they lost control, they became irrational. That was how he won. But this wasn't playing out the way it was supposed to. His grip tightened around the cigar, the heat still lingering in his fingertips. "You think that means something?" he scoffed, forcing himself to regain control, to fall back on the arrogance that had carried him through every moment of his career. "You think anyone here is going to do a damn thing about it?" Ayanna didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, just enough to let him feel the weight of her presence, just enough to remind him that she wasn't afraid. "You put your hands on me," she continued, her voice softer now, more dangerous. "In my courtroom. In front of witnesses. In front of cameras." For the first time, Calloway's eyes flickered toward the back of the room. The press was there. Reporters, cameras, all trained on him. The realization was slow, creeping, sinking into his gut like a cold knife. He had done this before. He had gotten away with worse. But never under these circumstances. Never in a place where every single move was documented, where every single word could be replayed, analyzed, twisted against him. Still, he forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "You're reaching," he said, though there was something weaker in his voice now. "You think anyone gives a damn about what happens in here? They'll spin it. Say you provoked me. Say you were out of line. Hell, they'll probably say you attacked me first. And who do you think they'll believe?" Ayanna tilted her head slightly, studying him, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the discomfort to settle in. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned to the bailiff standing near the bench. "Officer Marshall," she said evenly, "arrest Lieutenant Calloway." The room erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the jury box. Calloway barked out a laugh, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're joking," he said, his smirk returning. "You really think you can pull that?" The bailiff hesitated, his eyes darting between Ayanna and Calloway, uncertainty etched into his face. Calloway had been a force in the department for years. There were few officers who would dare cross him. But then he saw the way Ayanna stood, calm, composed, unshaken. He glanced at the reporters, at the cameras, at the silent agreement spreading through the room. And then he reached for his cuffs. Calloway's entire body tensed as the cold steel wrapped around his wrists. He jerked, trying to resist, but another officer moved in, grabbing his other arm. "You don't want to do this," Calloway growled, his voice low, seething. "You really don't want to do this." But no one moved to stop it. No one came to his defense. Ayanna watched as the reality of the moment finally hit him. His entire life had been built on the assumption that he was untouchable. That no matter how many lines he crossed, the system would protect him. But now, as he stood there with his hands bound, as the cameras captured every second of his humiliation, as the very system he had manipulated finally turned its back on him, he understood something that had never occurred to him before. He wasn't untouchable. Not anymore. Ayanna stepped forward one last time, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You wanted to remind me of my place," she murmured, her tone almost sympathetic. "I hope you enjoy yours." As the officers led him away, the courtroom still buzzing with disbelief, Ayanna turned back to the bench, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer, smoothing out the front of her shirt as if wiping away the last remnants of the moment. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because the world was watching. And Calloway wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. No, the real fight was just beginning. The silence in the courtroom was thick, a suffocating weight pressing down on everyone present. Mark Calloway stood frozen, his fingers still curled around the smoldering cigar, the ugly scent of burned flesh clinging to the air. Ayanna Caldwell remained standing, her expression unreadable, the mark on her cheek already blistering from the heat, yet she gave him nothing. No scream. No flinch. No reaction that he had expected. The power he had wielded so recklessly his entire life suddenly felt like it was slipping through his fingers, but his mind hadn't fully caught up to the reality of what had just happened. His body still vibrated with arrogance, with years of unchecked privilege, but there was something new creeping in now, an unfamiliar, foreign sensation clawing at the edges of his certainty. Uncertainty. The murmur in the crowd grew, the realization washing over the room like a wave of slow, dawning horror. Faces turned, whispers sharpened, and then, someone spoke. Not loud, but clear enough for it to slice through the dead air like a scalpel. "She's the judge." The words landed like a hammer. Calloway's chest tightened. His smirk wavered. His grip on the cigar slackened. No. That wasn't possible. That couldn't be possible. He had assumed, just as he always did, that the black woman standing before him was beneath him, someone who didn't belong, someone who could be silenced, controlled, put back in her place. But now, the realization was taking hold, sinking into his bones like ice water. He had assaulted the judge. He had attacked the one person in this room with the power to decide his fate. Ayanna didn't move right away. She let the weight of the moment settle, let the magnitude of his mistake unfurl in his mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, even, terrifying in its composure. "Officer Calloway," she said, not raising her voice, yet somehow making the entire room bend to her words. "Are you done?" The room was paralyzed. Calloway's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His mind scrambled for an excuse, for some explanation that would undo what had just happened. His gaze flicked toward the other officers in the room, his usual allies, the ones who had always covered for him, always had his back. But they weren't moving. They weren't stepping in. In fact, they were stepping away. Ayanna took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering, dissecting, stripping him down to nothing with a single look. "I'd like to remind you," she continued, her voice still calm, but now carrying a weight that made the air around them crackle, "that you are standing in a court of law. That this court is under my jurisdiction. And that what you just did, is a felony." A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Calloway's pulse hammered in his skull. Felony. Felony. The word pounded against his ribs, his breath coming short. No. No, 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 this wasn't how this was supposed to go. His voice caught. He swallowed, his throat dry as dust. "You didn't what?" Ayanna interrupted, her expression betraying nothing. "Didn't think. Didn't realize." She let the words hang between them, stretching the silence, letting him drown in it. Then, she nodded. "That's clear." Her gaze flicked toward the bailiff, a sharp, subtle command in her eyes. The bailiff hesitated only for a fraction of a second before stepping forward, his hand already resting on his belt. The shift in energy was immediate. The officers in the room, Calloway's own men, were exchanging uncertain glances, their rigid confidence now replaced by unease. They had watched him get away with so much before. But this? This was different. Calloway could feel it, too. The floor beneath him wasn't as steady as it had always been. The power he had wielded so effortlessly for years wasn't working this time. "I didn't mean," he started, his voice tight, desperate, weak. "You meant exactly what you did," Ayanna cut in, and there was something colder in her voice now. "But let me be clear about something, Officer Calloway. You're not walking out of here today as a cop." A visible shudder ran through him. "You're not walking out of here today as a free man." Panic clawed at his chest. His mind raced, searching for a way out, an exit, an excuse, anything to turn this around. He had always been able to turn things around. But Ayanna wasn't giving him an inch. She stepped back, gesturing toward the bailiff. "Arrest him." The room erupted. Calloway staggered back, his hands going up instinctively as the bailiff moved in. "You can't. This is insane. You can't do this." His voice, once filled with authority, now dripped with something dangerously close to fear. Ayanna tilted her head, considering him with something almost like curiosity. Then, she leaned in, just enough for her voice to be a whisper only he could hear. "Can't I?" That was it. That was the moment it truly sank in. The moment Calloway realized that everything was about to collapse around him. The courtroom was a chaos of voices, reporters scrambling to capture the moment, gasps and murmurs filling the space like an electric storm. The bailiff was already reaching for Calloway's arms, twisting them behind his back with a force that felt all too familiar, all too ironic. Wait, this is a mistake." Calloway struggled, but there was nothing he could do. The cold snap of handcuffs closing around his wrists sent a jolt through his system, a horrifyingly familiar sound, one he had heard 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never meant for him. Ayanna turned back toward the bench, lifting her gavel. "This court is adjourned," she said simply. And then, as the gavel struck wood, Calloway's world shattered. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the weight of the moment settled into every single person present. The murmur of voices swelled into a frenzied buzz, journalists whispering hurriedly into their recorders, legal clerks exchanging shocked glances, and the assembled spectators, some there for justice, others for mere spectacle, grasping for some way to process the shift in power that had just taken place. The air was electric with tension, the kind that only existed when something irreversible had just happened. Mark Calloway, the once untouchable lieutenant, now stood in the center of it all, his arms twisted behind his back, cold steel cuffs biting into his wrists, the badge on his chest rendered meaningless in an instant. His face was flushed, a deep red of disbelief, fury, humiliation, and something else, something he had never truly known before, raw, undiluted fear. His breath came in shallow gasps as the room around him blurred at the edges, his mind scrambling for a lifeline, an exit, a way out of the nightmare that was rapidly consuming him. But there was none. There was no protocol for this. No favors to call in. No superiors to shield him from the consequences of his own actions. Because this time, he was the one who had crossed the line. The bailiff's grip on his arm tightened as Calloway gave another instinctive jerk, his body reacting before his brain could fully accept what was happening. This is a joke," he spat, his voice rising, laced with desperation he couldn't quite mask. "You can't do this. I'm an officer of the law." The words felt hollow the second they left his lips, and he knew it. That badge had given him power for years, had been his armor, his shield, his license to do whatever he wanted, without hesitation, without consequence. And now, for the first time, it meant nothing. Worse than nothing, it was evidence against him. Ayanna Caldwell remained steady, her expression carved from stone, unshaken by his outburst, unmoved by his unraveling. She watched him with a gaze that felt heavier than the cuffs now digging into his skin, a gaze that wasn't fueled by anger or revenge, but by something more damning, certainty. He had spent his entire life exuding dominance, projecting the kind of confidence that came from never knowing real fear, real repercussions. And yet, standing before Ayanna now, in this courtroom, he had never felt smaller. "You're an officer of the law," she repeated, her voice measured, calm, almost surgical in its precision. "And yet, you stand here accused of a violent crime in front of an entire courtroom full of witnesses. You're right about one thing, Officer Calloway. This isn't a joke." She took a slow step forward, the echo of her heels clicking against the polished wood floor slicing through the noise like a blade. "This is justice." Calloway shook his head wildly, his pulse hammering in his ears, his breath coming short and sharp as he turned to the officers in the room, his colleagues, the ones who had always covered for him, always cleaned up after him, always protected him. But now they wouldn't even meet his gaze. Now, they shifted uncomfortably, some adjusting their belts, others simply staring at the floor, at the ceiling, at the walls, anywhere but at him. A few of them had expressions that almost resembled shame. And Calloway felt something snap inside him, something primal and ugly and desperate. This is bullshit. His voice cracked, not with rage, but with something closer to panic. You're all gonna just stand there. You're gonna let this happen. You know me. You know what I've done for this department. His eyes darted wildly, seeking out familiar faces, clinging to the hope that someone, anyone, would step in, would fix this. But the silence that met him was deafening. Ayanna exhaled slowly, and for the first time, the faintest hint of emotion crept into her expression, not pity, not sympathy, but something colder. They do know you, Calloway. They know exactly who you are. That's why none of them are stopping this. She tilted her head slightly, watching him with the precision of someone who had spent their entire life studying men like him, men who had always believed the world belonged to them simply because no one had ever told them otherwise. Until now. Tell me, Officer Calloway, she continued, her voice deceptively soft, but carrying the force of a hammer beneath it. How many times have you been in this exact position? She let the question hang between them, the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating. How many times have you stood in this very courtroom while a black man sat in that chair, hands cuffed behind his back, pleading for a chance to explain himself? Another step forward, her voice cutting through the thick air like a scalpel. And how many times did you listen? His breath hitched, his face twisting in something raw, something ugly. He felt exposed, stripped of the carefully constructed persona he had built for himself over the years, the one that had always kept him safe. He had never been on this side of the power dynamic before. He had never been the one pleading. Ayanna didn't move her gaze from him. You never listened, she answered for him, her voice unwavering. You never cared. And now, you want someone to care about you. A pause, sharp and deliberate. No, the word landed like a slap. Not today. A ragged breath escaped Calloway's throat, and for the first time, he looked truly lost. Helpless. It was a look Ayanna had seen before, on the faces of men and women who had come through these doors, trapped in a system that had never been designed to help them, only to punish. And yet, even now, she could see it in his eyes, he still thought there was a way out. He still thought this could be undone. The weight of the room pressed down harder, heavier. The silence was thick, suffocating, an unspoken verdict already forming in the air. The reality was sinking into Calloway now, dragging him down like an anchor. This wasn't just another accusation that could be brushed aside. This wasn't something that would disappear with a favor or a well-placed phone call. This was real. The courtroom doors swung open with a loud creak, and two more officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable, their presence final. One of them, an older officer, someone Calloway had known for years, approached slowly, his face a tight mask, but his eyes flickering with something almost like relief. He didn't say anything, not at first. He simply reached for Calloway's arm and pulled him forward with quiet efficiency, as though the act itself was inevitable, as though it had always been. Calloway jerked back, his voice coming out in a strangled rasp. No, wait, the officer ignored him. The cuffs tightened. The room swayed. And for the first time in his entire life, Mark Calloway was powerless. The air in the courtroom had shifted, thick with something unspoken, something final. The power that had once belonged to Mark Calloway had vanished, dissipating like smoke in the wind, leaving behind nothing but the weight of his choices pressing down on him with unbearable force. The moment the officers took hold of him, pulling him toward the exit, reality crashed into him like a freight train. This wasn't just a bad day. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the end. He could feel it, a crushing certainty that wrapped around his chest and squeezed. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, his feet dragging against the polished floor as if his body refused to accept what was happening. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to argue, to command the respect he had always been given without question. But no one was listening. The silence in the room wasn't just silence. It was judgment. The weight of every gaze, every set of eyes burning into him, watching him be led away in cuffs, was unbearable. He had seen this moment play out 1,000 times before, just never like this. Never with himself in the center of it, never with his hands bound, never with that dull, metallic cold biting into his skin. He could still hear the echo of Ayanna Caldwell's words ringing in his ears, that terrifying, unwavering calm in her voice when she had told him he wasn't walking out of there as a free man. That moment had sealed his fate. He had known then, even before the officers grabbed him, even before the cuffs clicked into place, that everything he had built, every ounce of power he had wielded so ruthlessly, was gone. As they reached the door, he tried one last time. He turned, his voice rough, strained, almost pleading. "This is a mistake. You're making a mistake." The officer escorting him didn't even flinch, didn't so much as acknowledge his words, as he pushed the heavy wooden door open, leading them into the cold, sterile hallway beyond the courtroom. But Calloway wasn't ready to let go. He looked over his shoulder, his gaze locking onto Ayanna. She hadn't moved from the bench, her expression unreadable, her posture as strong as ever. His voice dropped, his desperation cracking through. "This isn't over." Ayanna met his eyes, and for the first time, her expression shifted, not to anger, not to gloating, not to anything he had expected. Instead, what he saw was certainty. A quiet, undeniable resolve that sent a cold shudder down his spine. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, clear, carrying through the room like a gavel strike. "It is." And with that, the door shut behind him. The hallway was colder than the courtroom, the walls lined with framed photographs of judges and legal officials, men who had sat in seats of power, men who had passed judgment, men who had controlled the fates of countless others. It wasn't lost on Calloway that he had always assumed he would one day be among them. Maybe not as a judge, but as something greater than just another cop. He had believed he was untouchable, that the system had been built to protect him, to ensure that no matter how far he pushed the limits, no matter how many lines he blurred, he would always land on his feet. But now, that illusion had been shattered. And the worst part? He had done it to himself. The officers didn't speak as they led him down the hall. There were no murmurs of support, no reassurances from familiar voices. No one was stepping in to save him. No one wanted to. He realized now, too late, that even the ones who had once called him their own, the men who had laughed with him over drinks, who had backed him up on the streets, who had closed ranks around him when accusations had come flying, they had never truly respected him. They had feared him, yes. They had used him when it was convenient. But respect? Loyalty? That had never been real. And now that he was falling, they weren't about to catch him. They were letting him crash. The hallway opened up into a larger room, one Calloway had walked through 100 times before but had never entered like this. It was the processing area. A space meant for criminals, suspects, the people he had spent his life looking down on, judging, punishing. The irony clawed at his chest like a vice as they led him to a desk, where another officer sat waiting. He recognized the man, Detective Paul Richardson, someone who had once worked alongside him, someone who had once laughed at his jokes, shared his disdain for the very people they had sworn to protect. But there was no laughter now. No camaraderie. Richardson didn't even look up as he pulled out the necessary forms, his voice devoid of emotion as he asked the standard booking questions. Name. Calloway's jaw clenched. He could feel his pulse hammering against his skin, his entire body vibrating with rage, humiliation, disbelief. He didn't answer. Richardson didn't care. He simply sighed, checking the file. Mark Calloway, he muttered, writing it down without waiting for confirmation. Date of birth. Calloway's mouth was dry. He stared at the desk, at the pen in Richardson's hand, at the uniform he himself had worn for 20 years. None of it made sense. None of it felt real. He wanted to wake up. He wanted to rewind. But time only moved in one direction. And for the first time in his life, it wasn't moving in his favor. Lieutenant, he started, his voice cracking on the title he no longer had. You know this isn't right. Richardson finally looked up, and for the first time since Calloway had entered the room, he saw something in his old colleague's eyes that made his stomach twist: indifference. No sympathy. No anger. Just the cold, detached professionalism of a man doing his job. And that, more than anything, made Calloway's insides churn with something close to fear. He had never known what it felt like to be on this side of things, to be dismissed, reduced to just another name in the system. But now he knew. Now, it was his name being written down. His rights being read. His life crumbling beneath him. You did this to yourself, Mark, Richardson said finally, his voice flat, almost bored. You just never thought it would catch up to you. Calloway's breath came shallow, his throat tightening. He had always believed himself above the law, above consequences, above judgment. But here he was. A prisoner in his own world. He opened his mouth to argue, to fight, to plead, to do something, but before he could say a word, the officer beside him tightened his grip and pulled him away from the desk. The paperwork could wait. It was time to move him to a holding cell. And for the first time in his entire life, Mark Calloway was being led to a place where no badge could save him. The cold air inside the holding cell was different from the crisp, conditioned coolness of the precinct halls. This was a damp, suffocating chill, the kind that clung to the walls, to the metal bars, to the very breath that passed through the space. Mark Calloway sat on the thin, steel bench against the wall, his wrists still aching from the pressure of the cuffs. The tightness of his chest hadn't gone away. It had only worsened. The fluorescent light above him buzzed faintly, flickering every now and then, casting erratic shadows along the walls. There was no warmth here, no comfort, no illusion of authority. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the man standing outside the bars looking in. He was inside. And every second that passed felt like another nail in the coffin of the life he had built. The reality of it all hadn't fully settled in, or maybe he was refusing to let it. His mind was still clawing for explanations, for loopholes, for someone to step in and fix this. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. He had been the one making arrests, the one dictating the rules, the one deciding whose life was ruined and whose was spared. And yet here he was, just another name on a list, just another inmate waiting for processing. He could hear voices beyond the bars, officers he had worked with for years, talking in low murmurs. He knew they were talking about him. He could hear his name, hear the hushed tones, the disbelief laced in some, the amusement in others. They were enjoying this. They were watching their former superior, their former leader, the man who had once commanded their respect and fear, being brought down to nothing. And the worst part? None of them were going to stop it. A voice cut through the noise, sharp and authoritative. Calloway. The sound of his own name made his stomach clench. He looked up slowly, his pulse thrumming in his ears. Standing outside the bars, just beyond his reach, was her. Ayanna Caldwell. She was still in her robes, though they no longer felt like the formality of a judge's attire. Now, they felt like a symbol of something greater. A finality. A reminder of who held the power now. He swallowed, his throat dry, his pride twisting into something bitter and rotten inside him. You shouldn't be here, he muttered, his voice rasping against the weight of his humiliation. You got what you wanted. Why are you here? Ayanna didn't move, didn't flinch at his words. Her hands rested calmly in front of her, her face unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, something Calloway couldn't quite decipher, and that made him even more uneasy. "I came to see it for myself," she said, her voice smooth, unshaken. "To see if you understand what just happened to you." His jaw tightened, his hands forming into fists at his sides. "I understand just fine," he spat, though there was a tremor beneath his words. "You wanted to humiliate me, and you did. Congratulations. You're no better than the people you claim to fight for." A slow, deliberate exhale escaped Ayana's lips, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said, and her voice was softer now, but somehow even heavier. "This isn't about humiliation, Calloway. This is about accountability. Something you've never had to face. Until now." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head, but there was no humor in it. "And what? You think locking me in here changes anything? You think this means you won?" His eyes burned into hers, desperate for something, anything, to break in her composure, but she gave him nothing. "You think people like me don't come back from things like this?" Ayana tilted her head slightly, considering him, as if she was looking at something far smaller than the man he had once believed himself to be. "People like you," she repeated, letting the words settle between them, letting him feel the weight of his own arrogance. Then, she leaned slightly closer, her voice lowering just enough to force him to listen. "People like you only come back when we let them. And this time, no one's letting you." Calloway's stomach churned. There was no bluff in her words. No hesitation. She wasn't speaking from anger or from vengeance. She was speaking from truth. And that was more terrifying than anything else. Because it meant there was no escape. His mind scrambled for something, anything to grab onto. "I know how this works," he said, grasping for control, for dominance, for anything that would put him back on top. "I know the system. I know people. I know that charges like these don't hold unless someone makes sure they do." He forced himself to smirk, though it was weak, fractured. "You think they'll really follow through with this? A cop being thrown in prison? That doesn't happen." Ayana studied him for a long moment, then smiled. It wasn't a smile of amusement or triumph. It was a smile of certainty. A slow, measured, unshakable certainty that sent an icy ripple down Calloway's spine. "It does when there's proof." She let the word linger, let it settle deep into his bones before she continued. "The entire courtroom saw what you did, Calloway. On camera. Do you think the world is going to look away this time? Do you think people aren't watching, waiting, expecting justice? This isn't just a case anymore. It's a reckoning. And for once, you're not the one in control." His breath came shallow, his vision narrowing. He had always believed himself untouchable, always assumed there was a way out, an angle to play. But not this time. He could feel the walls closing in, the space around him getting smaller, his world shrinking down to this cell, to this moment, to the truth he could no longer outrun. Ayana took a step back, her hands still clasped, her eyes still locked onto him with a certainty that made him feel like he was already buried. "You wanted power," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "And for a long time, you had it. You used it however you wanted. Without limits. Without consequences. But now. Now you know what it feels like to be powerless." She let that final sentence land, let it carve itself into his mind, into his soul, before she turned toward the door. Calloway's throat tightened, his body rigid with the weight of everything he had lost. "Wait," he blurted, the word tumbling out before he could stop it. "Wait." It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't arrogance. It was something raw, something fragile, something he didn't even recognize in himself. Ayana stopped but didn't turn. Silence stretched between them, an unspoken question hanging in the air. He had nothing left. No power. No control. No one standing in his corner. For the first time, he was the one pleading. But Ayanna only shook her head, exhaling softly. "No," she said, her voice calm, final, the last judgment he would ever hear from her. "It's too late." And then, she walked away, leaving him alone in the cold, empty silence of his new reality. For the first time in his life, Mark Calloway had no way out. The cell was suffocating. The walls, the bars, the air itself, it all felt like it was closing in on him, pressing down with an unbearable weight that Mark Calloway had never known before. He had spent his entire life walking through the world with an ease most never had, an ease that came from knowing he was protected. The badge had been his shield, his armor, his power. But now, stripped of everything, he felt exposed. Vulnerable. Trapped. The echoes of Ayanna Caldwell's voice still rang in his ears, the finality of her words settling into his bones like lead. Powerless. That's what she had said. That's what she had made him. His hands curled into fists on his lap, but there was no strength in them. There was no one to intimidate here. No one to silence. No one to push back down. For the first time, there was no one beneath him. And that realization gnawed at his insides, twisting and knotting into something unbearable. His throat was dry, his pulse erratic, his mind running in desperate circles, searching for a way out, an angle, a lifeline. But there wasn't one. There was only this. The voices outside his cell were a distant hum, officers moving about, going on with their lives, their routines unchanged despite the fact that his had just crumbled into dust. He could hear them talking, their voices carrying down the cold hallway, but they weren't talking about cases, or perps, or city politics. They were talking about him. "You see the way she handled him? Never thought I'd see the day. Man always thought he was untouchable. Guess not." It stung more than he expected. Not just the words, but who they were coming from. Men who had stood beside him for years. Men who had laughed at his jokes, who had backed him up without question, who had protected him. They weren't defending him now. They weren't questioning what had happened or whispering about how to make it all go away. They were watching him fall. And they weren't going to catch him. The thought made his stomach churn. He had no allies. No favors left to call in. No superiors willing to stick their necks out. Not for him. Not after this. He had spent his career keeping his kind of people safe, the ones who had done what they wanted, walked where they wanted, enforced their own brand of law. But now, they were gone. They were silent. And silence was worse than condemnation. His head dropped into his hands, fingers pressing against his temples, trying to stop the pounding in his skull. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. A slow creak echoed through the hallway, and his head snapped up at the sound of approaching footsteps. He recognized them immediately, measured, deliberate, not hurried, not uncertain. She was back. Ayanna Caldwell stopped just outside his cell, her presence an undeniable force even without words. Calloway's breath came short, shallow, his mind racing to find something, anything, to say. Something that could change this. But nothing came. She studied him, and he hated it. Hated the way her gaze stripped him down to the very core, to the rawest part of himself that he had never let anyone see. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't anger. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something worse. It was certainty. "You still think you're getting out of this, don't you?" Her voice was calm, even, but there was a weight behind it, the kind that made his chest feel even tighter. He swallowed, his throat raw. "I know how this works." Her eyebrow lifted, just slightly. "Do you?" He forced himself to sit up straighter, trying to reclaim some shred of the dominance he had always carried so effortlessly. "You think this is over," he muttered, his voice rough. "You think throwing me in here makes you the winner?" He let out a small, bitter laugh, though it felt weak in his own ears. "People like me don't stay down for long." Ayanna tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Then, she took a step closer. "People like you," she said slowly, as if weighing each word carefully, "are finally being seen for what they are." She let that settle before continuing. "Do you understand what's happening right now, Calloway? This isn't just about you. This isn't just about this moment. This is about everything you've ever done. Every report buried. Every case dismissed. Every man you brutalized thinking no one would care." His jaw tightened, but she wasn't done. "For the first time, people are paying attention. And you can't stop it." Calloway exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a smirk that didn't quite land. "You really think this is justice?" His voice was low, laced with something bitter, something desperate. "You think you fixed anything?" He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Tomorrow, another cop will do the same damn thing I did. Next week, another case will come through this courthouse. Nothing changes." Ayanna let a silence stretch between them, long and heavy, before she spoke again. "You're right," she admitted, and for a brief second, his pulse kicked up. But then she took another step closer, lowering her voice just enough that the words cut sharper. "The system is still broken. But today, you're proof that it can crack." The air between them thickened, and Calloway felt it. The shift. The power that had been his, slipping through his fingers, never to return. He could argue. He could fight. He could spit every excuse in the book. But it didn't matter anymore. He had lost. His breath came shallow. He wanted to stand, to loom over her like he had done to so many others before. But there was no point. He wasn't above her anymore. He wasn't above anyone. And for the first time in his life, he truly understood what that meant. Ayanna took one last look at him, then exhaled, her shoulders straightening. "You don't have to believe it," she said, her voice firm, steady. "But you'll feel it." And with that, she turned. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't linger. She didn't need to. She had said all that needed to be said. The sound of her footsteps faded as she walked away, but Calloway didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the bars, at the walls, at the truth that surrounded him now. He had spent his life believing men like him would always walk free. But now, he was just another prisoner. The cell door clanged shut behind him, sealing Mark Calloway inside a world he never thought he'd belong to. The walls were bare, the air stale, the weight of confinement pressing down on him like an invisible force that he couldn't escape. He had spent decades believing himself untouchable, believing that his actions, no matter how cruel, no matter how blatant, would never catch up to him. That he was part of a system designed to protect men like him, to shield them from the consequences that others were forced to endure. But now he was on the other side. Days passed. Then weeks. The world outside moved on, while his had shrunk down to the size of a metal cot, a rusted toilet, and the same gray walls staring back at him. The newspapers had his name plastered across their pages for a while. News channels dissected his downfall, panels of commentators debating what his conviction meant, if it meant anything at all. His mugshot circulated the internet, a stark contrast to the crisp uniformed photos that had once defined his career. He was no longer a lieutenant. No longer a respected officer. No longer anything but a symbol of the very corruption he had spent years upholding. The irony of it all burned in his chest like acid. But the world did not mourn him. No one from his past reached out. The same officers who had laughed with him, covered for him, followed his orders without question. They had moved on. The silence was deafening. No favors left to call in. No one left to make this disappear. He had learned the hardest truth of all, men like him were only untouchable until they weren't useful anymore. And then, the final blow came. A trial. A public, high-profile spectacle, where every crime he had ever committed was laid bare. Every report that had been buried, every complaint that had been dismissed, every time someone had spoken out against him only to be silenced, all of it came back. Witness after witness testified against him, people he had forgotten, people he had hurt, people who had spent years waiting for this moment. He had no defense. No excuses. No way out. The same system that had once protected him now swallowed him whole. And when the verdict was read? Guilty. Every charge. Every count. No mercy. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The room erupted. Gasps, tears, relief. A sound he had never understood before, justice. But the loudest sound was silence. His own. Sitting there, shackled, realizing that his life, as he knew it, was over. Ayanna Caldwell was there. She stood in the back, not celebrating, not gloating, but watching. Not because she enjoyed seeing him fall, but because she had always known this moment was inevitable. She had seen it happen so many times before, just never to the ones who truly deserved it. And now, finally, for once, the scales had tipped. She left the courtroom that day, not with triumph, but with something deeper. Resolution. The battle wasn't over. One trial, one conviction, wouldn't undo centuries of injustice. But it was a start. A crack in the armor of a system that had always claimed to be untouchable. And for the first time in her career, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible. Months passed. The world moved forward. Calloway faded from headlines, reduced to just another forgotten name in the prison system. He had spent his life fearing nothing, believing himself invincible. But in here, he was just another inmate. No power. No badge. No respect. And the men around him? They had been waiting for him. The same men he had arrested, humiliated, brutalized. The walls had eyes. The cells had memories. And Calloway quickly learned that justice doesn't stop at the courtroom doors. Ayanna, meanwhile, continued her work. She became more than just a judge. She became a force. Her courtroom became known for what it represented: fairness, integrity, accountability. She fought, not just for justice, but for something greater. Change. She was no longer the woman who had to prove she belonged. She was the woman who decided who did. And as for Calloway, he spent his days trapped in a system he had helped create, only now, he was on the receiving end of it. The whispers followed him down every hallway. The looks. The murmurs. The threats. He had no allies here. No favors to call in. He was alone. And he knew, deep down, this was exactly where he deserved to be. This was the reality he had built. And now, it was the only one he had left. But here's the question. If this story had gone another way, if the cameras hadn't been there, if the world hadn't been watching, if Ayanna Caldwell hadn't been who she was, would Calloway still be free? Would he still have walked out of that courtroom untouched? How many times has this happened before? How many times has justice been denied? And how many times will it still be denied before something truly changes? Think about that. And if you believe that these stories matter, if you believe that these conversations need to happen, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because stories like this aren't just fiction. They're real. And they're happening every day. The only question is, who's watching?